If you have ever wondered what it truly felt like to be the most powerful woman in the ancient world, in the hour before the world woke up and started demanding things of her, then settle in, because tonight we are going to spend a very long, very slow hour inside the private morning of Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt. And I promise you, almost everything you think you know about her morning is wrong, because it was not about vanity at all. It was about survival, strategy, chemistry, empire, and one very quiet, very dangerous hour before the sun rose over Alexandria, when a queen became, briefly, just a woman alone with her own reflection. Stay with me tonight, because by the end of this hour you will understand not just what oils touched her skin, but why touching the wrong oil in the wrong order could have ended her life, why her mirror was one of the most heavily guarded objects in the ancient world, and why the quiet ritual of her morning skincare was, in truth, one of the most calculated political performances ever conducted before breakfast. Let your body sink into the bed now. Let your shoulders drop. There is nothing you need to do tonight except listen, and let the warm, slow river of this story carry you gently towards sleep, the way the Nile once carried barges of oil and perfume up toward the palace docks in the hush before dawn. We begin, as all mornings in Alexandria began, in darkness. It is somewhere around the year 40 before the Common Era. The palace complex of Alexandria sits on its peninsula, jutting out into the dark Mediterranean. The great lighthouse of Pharos still burning somewhere out on its island, a slow orange eye watching over black water. Inside the royal quarters, in a chamber whose walls are painted with lotus flowers and hunting scenes in blues and golds that no torchlight can properly show off at this hour, one woman is already awake, though the rest of the palace still sleeps. She has always been an early riser. Later, historians and gossiping court scribes would say this was vanity, that she rose early simply to spend more hours beautifying herself than any other woman alive. But if you had actually been standing quietly in the corner of that chamber, which of course no one but her most trusted attendants ever were permitted to do, you would have seen something far more interesting than vanity. You would have seen a woman treating her own face and body the way a general treats a map before battle. Because every single day, in a matter of hours, this woman was going to walk out of this chamber and become, in front of ambassadors, priests, soldiers, and spies, the living embodiment of a goddess. And a goddess cannot arrive looking as though she has simply woken up. Let's slow down here, because this is important, and this is the first thing that most people get wrong about Cleopatra's mornings. They imagine her surrounded by a dozen servants from the very first moment her eyes open. A swirl of hands and oils and chatter. That is not how it happened. In the earliest moments of the morning, before the sky had even begun to lighten along the harbor, Cleopatra was almost always alone, or accompanied only by a single trusted attendant, someone who had served her since childhood, someone whose silence could be trusted completely. This was not a public ritual yet. This was the private, unglamorous beginning, the part no ambassador ever saw, the part closer to what any of us do in the quiet dark before a long day. Except that for her, the stakes of that day could mean war, poison, betrayal, or peace. She would begin, oddly enough, not with her face, but with water. Plain water, warm, carried in a wide, shallow basin of beaten bronze, or, on more comfortable mornings, one lined with a thin sheet of gold, though gold basins were more often reserved for ceremonial washing rather than this first private rinse. The water itself had already traveled a long way before it reached her chamber. It had been drawn the evening before from cisterns fed by the Nile, filtered through layers of sand and cloth to remove silt, and then left to settle overnight in large jars so that any remaining sediment would sink to the bottom. This filtered water was then gently warmed, not boiled, simply warmed, using heated stones lowered carefully into the jar, because boiling water in a metal vessel over direct flame in the sleeping quarters was considered both a fire risk and, frankly, beneath the dignity of a queen's morning ritual. She would dip her hands into this warm water and simply hold them there for a moment. This is worth pausing on, because it tells us something true about her that all the legends of seduction and spectacle tend to erase. In this one private moment, in the dark and the quiet, Cleopatra was not a legend. She was a woman with tired eyes, waking her own body up, gathering herself, the same as anyone does. The same as you might be doing right now, in your own bed, as your body slowly lets go of the tension of the day and prepares to drift. Now here comes our first turning point in the story tonight, because there is something almost nobody tells you about this water ritual, and it changes the entire way we should think about Cleopatra's skincare. The water was not simply for washing. It was infused, quietly and specifically, with crushed rock salt gathered from the salt flats near the Wadi Natron, the very same natron-rich basin that Egyptian embalmers used to dry and preserve the bodies of the dead. Cleopatra's mourning water contained a diluted trace of the same mineral compound that would one day be used to prepare a body for the afterlife. Historians have long debated whether this was simple coincidence, since natron was an extremely common substance in Egyptian daily life used for everything from cleaning teeth to making glass, or whether it carried a deeper symbolic weight for a queen who considered herself the living incarnation of the goddess Isis, a goddess deeply associated with resurrection, transformation, and the passage between life and death. Whatever the reason, every single morning, in the most literal chemical sense, Cleopatra washed her face with a whisper of the same substance used to prepare mummies for eternity. Sit with that for a moment. The most seductive wooer in ancient history began her day, quite literally, touching the chemistry of death and rebirth. After this first rinse, her attendant would pat her face dry, never rub, always pat, using a cloth of the finest linen, woven so tightly that it barely absorbed water, but also would not scratch or irritate the skin. Egyptian linen at this level of quality was itself an extraordinary technology. Spun from flax fibers so fine that some surviving samples from royal tombs have thread counts that modern textile historians still find difficult to fully replicate by hand. This was not ordinary cloth. This was cloth reserved for royalty. Cloth so smooth it felt almost like water itself against tired skin. Now, with her face clean and dry, we arrive at the true beginning of the ritual that history remembers, though even here, the truth is stranger and slower than the legend. The first substance to touch her skin was not perfume, and it was not the famous milk of legend either. It was oil. Plain, unscented oil, usually pressed from moringa seeds, a tree that grew both in Egypt and was imported in larger quantities from regions further south and east along Red Sea trade routes. Moringa oil was prized in the ancient world for a very practical reason that had nothing to do with luxury. It resisted rancidity far longer than many other plant oils, meaning it could be stored for months without spoiling in Egypt's intense heat, an enormously important quality in a world without refrigeration. This oil was warmed slightly between the attendant's palms and then smoothed across Cleopatra's face, throat, and upper chest in slow, deliberate strokes, always moving upward and outward, following what her physicians and cosmeticians believed was the natural direction of the body's internal energies and fluids. And here is our second turning point, something that will genuinely surprise you if you have only ever heard the popular version of this story. This oil was not simply cosmetic. It was medicinal, prescribed and monitored by physicians attached to the royal household, because the coastal air of Alexandria, thick with salt spray from the harbor, and the fine white dust kicked up by constant construction and traffic through the city's famous wide avenues, was notoriously harsh on skin. Ancient physicians, following medical traditions that stretched back centuries into pharaonic Egypt, believed that unprotected skin absorbed the harmful qualities of bad air, and that a barrier of oil was essential, not just for beauty but for actual physical health. In other words, this morning oil application, so often reduced in popular retellings to simple vanity, was in the eyes of everyone in that room a genuine medical treatment, as serious in its own context as any modern doctor prescribing a daily medication. Let your breathing slow now as we continue moving through this quiet oiled dark. There is no rush here. We have a full hour together, and Cleopatra herself was never rushed in these private moments either. Rushing was for the afternoon, for the court, for the endless demands of empire. The morning belonged to slowness. After the moringa oil had been worked into her skin and allowed to sit for a period of time roughly equivalent to what we might now call 10 or 15 minutes, though the ancient world, of course, measured time far more loosely, using the position of shadows or the burning of a marked candle rather than precise minutes, her attendant would return with the second basin. This one contained something far more famous and far more misunderstood: milk. Now, popular history has turned Cleopatra's milk baths into something almost cartoonish, an image of the queen luxuriously submerged in a marble tub filled to the brim with fresh milk. And while there is some truth buried in that image, the reality of her actual morning routine was much smaller in scale, much more precise, and honestly, much more interesting. She did not bathe her entire body in milk every single morning. That would have required a genuinely staggering quantity of milk, and even for a queen of Egypt's wealth, that level of daily waste would have been impractical and, frankly, wasteful in a way that would have concerned her advisors, since milk in ancient Egypt, while not as scarce as in some other regions, was still a valuable commodity, tied to the health and productivity of donkeys, goats, and occasionally cattle kept specifically for this purpose within the palace grounds. Instead, what actually happened most mornings was this. A modest basin, holding perhaps the equivalent of what we would today measure as 1 or 2 liters, was filled with donkey's milk specifically, not cow's milk, because donkey's milk was believed, correctly as it turns out based on later chemical analysis, to be closer in composition to human skin's natural oils and gentler on sensitive facial skin. This milk had been drawn that same morning, before dawn, from a small herd of she-donkeys kept specifically for the royal household's cosmetic needs, animals whose milking schedule was coordinated precisely with the queen's own waking hours by a dedicated staff whose entire job, their entire purpose in the vast machinery of the Egyptian court, was simply to ensure fresh donkey's milk arrived at the correct temperature at the correct hour every single morning without fail. Think about that scale for a moment, because it is our third turning point tonight. An entire small operation of the ancient Egyptian court, herders, milkers, runners, carrying warm vessels through palace corridors in the dark, existed for one purpose alone: to make sure that when Cleopatra dipped a cloth into a basin each morning, the milk within it was fresh, warm, and ready. This was not milk from a market stall. This was milk with its own supply chain, its own dedicated laborers, its own quiet bureaucracy, all in service of roughly 15 minutes of a queen's private morning. The milk was applied not by full immersion but with soft cloths soaked and then pressed gently against her face, neck, and the delicate skin along her collarbone and upper arms, left to sit while the natural acids in the milk, what we now understand as lactic acid, went to work gently softening and lifting away the outermost dead layer of skin cells, a process modern dermatology would recognize instantly as a mild chemical exfoliation. The ancient Egyptians had no concept of lactic acid or cellular chemistry, of course. What they understood was empirical and practical. Milk applied this way left skin visibly smoother and brighter by the time it was rinsed away, and so the practice had been refined and passed down through generations of royal cosmeticians long before Cleopatra herself was born, a tradition she inherited rather than invented, though popular history has almost entirely forgotten every queen before her who perfected this same technique. While the milk sat on her skin, something else was happening in the chamber. Something that brings us to our fourth turning point, and this one concerns not her face at all, but her eyes. Because even while her skin was being treated, a separate attendant, usually a woman specifically trained from childhood in the art of cosmetic mineral preparation, was seated nearby grinding a small quantity of dark mineral powder against a flat palette, using a smooth stone pestle in slow circular motions. This powder would become the famous kohl that outlined Cleopatra's eyes. But what almost nobody realizes is that the kohl was not primarily decorative in its original conception. It was medicinal and protective first, decorative second. The base mineral was most commonly galena, a lead sulfide ore, ground painstakingly fine, though in Cleopatra's time, more sophisticated recipes had already developed that included malachite for a green tint along the lower lash line, and a variety of other minerals mixed in specific ratios depending on the desired final color and the particular cosmetician's personal recipe. Recipes that were often closely guarded family secrets passed from mother to daughter within specific lineages of palace attendants. The powder would be mixed with a small amount of animal fat, usually goose fat, chosen for its smooth, low-melting consistency, and sometimes a drop of resin from acacia trees was added to help the mixture adhere better to the delicate skin around the eye. Now here is what almost every modern retelling gets wrong, and it is worth dwelling on, because it fundamentally changes how we should understand this entire ritual. Egyptian physicians, and there is genuine ancient medical writing that supports this, believed that applying kohl around the eyes actually protected against eye infections and reduced glare from the harsh Egyptian sun, and modern toxicology and microbiology research conducted in recent decades has actually found some legitimate basis for at least part of this belief, since certain lead compounds present in ancient kohl formulations can trigger the body's production of nitric oxide, which in small controlled amounts has genuine antimicrobial properties. Though of course we now also know that lead exposure carries serious long-term health risks that the ancient Egyptians could not have understood. So in this one small pot of dark powder, ground fresh every single morning for Cleopatra's eyes, we find a genuinely fascinating collision of ancient practical medicine, Real, if accidental, biochemistry, deep religious symbolism tied to the eye of Horus and protection from evil, and the aesthetic beauty standards of an entire civilization, all mixed together with goose fat on a stone palette in the candlelit dark before sunrise. Let yourself relax further into this image. A queen, eyes closed, milk-soaked cloths resting against her cheeks, while nearby the soft grinding sound of stone against stone slowly produces the dark powder that will, within the hour, transform her eyes into the almond-shaped, elongated symbol of divine authority that every surviving statue and coin still shows us today. There is no rush in this room. There is only preparation, patient and exact, layer building upon layer, the way sleep itself builds slowly if you let it, one soft layer of relaxation settling over another. After the milk had done its work, it was rinsed away, again with warm filtered water, and her skin was patted dry once more with fresh linen. And now we arrive at what many historians consider the true centerpiece of her morning ritual, and our fifth turning point in tonight's story, because this next stage is where actual surviving historical evidence becomes both richest and, in some ways, most surprising. The Egyptians of Cleopatra's era, and Cleopatra herself, specifically according to several ancient sources, including later Roman writers who, despite their obvious biases and frequent exaggerations about her, still recorded details about her personal habits that align remarkably well with what archaeology has since confirmed, were deeply devoted to the practice of layering multiple specific oils and unguents onto the skin, in a very particular sequence, each one chosen for a different purpose, each one applied to a different part of the face or body, almost like a modern skincare routine, with its cleanser, its serum, its moisturizer, its final protective layer, except accomplished with substances gathered from across the entire known ancient world through trade networks that stretched from the Horn of Africa to India. The next substance applied to her face after the moringa oil and milk treatment was a specially prepared cream, and this is where we encounter one of the genuinely most remarkable facts in this entire story. Ancient sources, along with modern experimental archaeology that has attempted to recreate these formulations, describe a cream containing beeswax, olive oil, and rosewater, combined in careful proportions and gently heated together until they formed a smooth, stable emulsion, essentially the ancient ancestor of the modern moisturizing cream that sits in your own bathroom cabinet today. This is not a coincidence of similar ingredients. This exact combination, oil, wax, and water, remains the fundamental chemical basis of nearly every moisturizing cream produced anywhere in the world today, more than 2,000 years later. The formula that soothed Cleopatra's skin in the dark hours before dawn is, in its basic chemical architecture, still sitting in bathroom cabinets around the world tonight, just as you may have one sitting in yours right now, waiting for tomorrow morning. The rosewater itself deserves a moment of its own attention, because it did not simply appear in Alexandria. Rose cultivation and rosewater distillation had already been practiced for centuries in Persia and further east, and the roses used in Cleopatra's court were, according to several ancient accounts, imported specifically for the palace's cosmetic and perfume needs, grown in specially maintained gardens, either within the palace grounds themselves or on nearby estates, dedicated to producing flowers exclusively for royal use. The petals were gathered at dawn, when their essential oils were believed to be most concentrated and least likely to have evaporated in the heat of the day, then gently distilled using a slow process of steam extraction that had been refined by Egyptian and Persian chemists over generations. This meant that the rosewater touching Cleopatra's face each morning represented not a single day's labor, but the culmination of an entire supply chain spanning gardens, distillers, traders, and ships, all converging on one small jar sitting beside her mirror. And now, as this beeswax and rosewater cream settled into her skin, we come to our sixth turning point, and this one concerns not what was applied to her, but who was actually in the room, because the popular image of Cleopatra, surrounded by a swarm of servants during this most private stage of her mourning, is, according to most careful historical reconstruction, almost certainly wrong. During this specific phase, the deepest, most private phase of her mourning ritual, ancient sources and modern historians, studying Ptolemaic court structure, agree that Cleopatra would have been attended by remarkably few people, likely no more than 2 or 3 trusted women, often including at least one attendant who had served her since her own childhood in the palace, a woman whose loyalty had been tested over years, and whose discretion was, quite literally, a matter of the queen's physical safety. Because remember, this was not merely a beauty ritual. This was one of the only times in her entire day when Cleopatra's body itself, unclothed, unguarded by royal robes and ceremonial jewelry, was fully exposed and vulnerable. Poison could be introduced through a cosmetic. A blade could be hidden in a cloth. The women in that room were not simply beauticians. They were, in the truest sense, the final line of the queen's personal security, chosen as carefully as any palace guard, their loyalty tested and retested. Their families often kept close to the palace precisely so that loyalty could be, in the darker political logic of the era, subtly guaranteed. This is worth sitting with for a moment as you drift further into rest tonight. Every jar, every cloth, every drop of oil that touched Cleopatra's skin had passed through the hands of women whose own lives, and often the lives of their families, depended entirely on the queen's continued survival and trust. The quiet, gentle ritual we have been describing was, underneath its softness, one of the highest-stakes moments of trust in the entire Ptolemaic court. Let's slow down even further now, because we still have so much of this morning left to explore together, and there's no need to hurry through any of it. After the beeswax and rosewater cream had been smoothed across her face and allowed to absorb, attention moved to her hands and feet, an often overlooked part of ancient Egyptian cosmetic practice that actually held enormous cultural and religious significance. Both her hands and the soles of her feet would be treated with a paste made primarily from crushed henna leaves, mixed with water, and a small amount of lemon juice imported from groves along the Mediterranean coast, allowed to sit and darken the skin slightly with a warm reddish tint. That was considered both beautifying and, in Egyptian religious symbolism, protective, since henna was associated with fertility, health, and the favor of several protective household deities. This is our 7th turning point tonight, and it is one that connects Cleopatra's private mourning directly to the deepest religious currents of her civilization, because the application of henna was not treated as mere decoration by anyone in that room. It was, in its own quiet way, a small daily religious act, a renewal of protective symbolism painted fresh each morning onto the very palms and soles that would carry the queen through her day, through negotiations with Roman generals, through religious ceremonies where she would be worshipped as the living Isis, through every step she took across marble floors that had been walked by her father and his father before him, stretching back through nearly 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule in Egypt. While the henna set, her hair was addressed, and here again we find popular history has significantly distorted the reality. The image most people carry of Cleopatra involves an elaborate, towering wig, heavily curled and often depicted with the vulture headdress or cobra diadem sitting atop it, but during this early private phase of her mourning, her hair was actually kept remarkably simple. Ancient Egyptian royalty of this era, men and women alike, commonly shaved their natural hair very short or entirely, for reasons that were partly practical. Given Egypt's intense heat and the persistent problem of lice in a world without modern hygiene standards, and partly religious, since certain priestly and royal traditions associated a shaved head with ritual purity. Cleopatra's own natural hair, what remained of it, was oiled with a lighter, more fragrant oil than the moringa oil used on her face, often infused with cinnamon bark, imported from trade routes stretching all the way to regions of South Asia, and the elaborate wigs and headdresses that we associate with her public image would not be applied until much, much later in the morning, during a completely separate and far more heavily staffed phase of preparation that more closely resembled what we might recognize as her true public getting-ready process. This brings us to our 8th turning point, and it is perhaps the most surprising of the entire story, because it forces us to completely reconsider what Cleopatra's morning skincare routine actually means. Everything we have described so far, the water, the moringa oil, the milk, the kohl preparation, the beeswax cream, the henna, the simple oiled hair, all of this happened in near total privacy, in near total darkness, often before the sky outside had even begun to properly lighten. This was not a performance. This was not for anyone's benefit, but her own body's genuine health and comfort. The elaborate, dramatic, heavily perfumed and jeweled version of Cleopatra that history remembers, that appears on coins and in later Roman accounts and in centuries of paintings and films, did not exist yet at this point in the morning. That version of Cleopatra was still being built, piece by piece, hour by hour, and would not be complete until well after what we would now consider mid-morning. Let this settle over you like a warm blanket as you continue drifting. Even the most powerful, most legendary woman of the ancient world spent the first quietest hour of her day as something closer to an ordinary person, tired, careful, deliberate, tending to her own body in near silence before the enormous machinery of empire and performance switched on around her. Now, as the sky outside her chamber's high windows finally began to show the first faint gray of pre-dawn light, the pace of the room would gradually shift, and more attendants would quietly begin entering. And this is where we reach our ninth turning point, because the substance that arrives next in her routine is, without question, the one most closely associated with Cleopatra in popular imagination, and yet its actual application and purpose is far more precise and far more strategic than most people realize. Perfume. Cleopatra's relationship with scent was not simply about smelling pleasant. Ancient sources, including some Roman accounts written by men who, despite clear political motivation to portray her as manipulative and excessive, nonetheless recorded specific and consistent details about her use of perfume that historians have found credible, describe her as having overseen, quite literally, her own perfume production facilities, with some ancient writers specifically mentioning perfume workshops associated with her name near the Dead Sea region, an area famous in antiquity for producing balsam, one of the most valuable aromatic substances in the entire ancient world, so valuable that entire military campaigns were fought over control of the groves that produced it. At this stage of the morning, a specific blend, prepared the previous day by dedicated perfumers who worked exclusively for the royal household, would be brought to her chamber in a small alabaster vessel, alabaster being chosen specifically because ancient perfumers understood, through long empirical experience even without modern chemistry, that this particular stone helped preserve delicate scent compounds far better than ceramic or metal containers, which could react with certain aromatic oils and degrade them more quickly. The blend applied at this hour, according to the most careful historical reconstructions available, most likely centered around a base of Egyptian lily and myrrh, cut with a small quantity of cinnamon and, crucially, a compound called kaifi, an extraordinarily complex incense and perfume blend unique to Egypt, sometimes containing more than a dozen separate ingredients, including honey, wine, raisins, juniper, and various resins, all combined through a labor-intensive process that could take days to properly prepare, and was considered one of the true luxury products of the entire ancient Mediterranean world. Kaifi was not applied casually. It was dabbed with precision at specific pulse points, behind the ears, at the base of the throat, along the inner wrists, points where ancient perfumers understood correctly that body heat would gradually release the scent throughout the day, in a slow, controlled manner, rather than overwhelming a room all at once. And here is what makes this moment in her morning so quietly fascinating, our 10th and final major turning point in tonight's story, though certainly not the end of our journey together through this long, slow morning. The specific perfume blend chosen was not arbitrary or simply a matter of personal preference each day. According to the most credible historical analysis, the particular scent Cleopatra wore was frequently adjusted, subtly but deliberately, based on who she would be meeting that day. A blend heavier in myrrh and deeper, more solemn notes might be selected for a morning involving religious ceremony or a meeting with Egyptian priests, where she needed to embody the gravity and divine authority of her role as living Isis. A brighter blend, lighter in lily and citrus notes, might be chosen for a day involving diplomatic negotiation with foreign envoys, where warmth and approachability needed to be subtly communicated before she had even spoken a single word. When historical accounts describe her meeting with Mark Antony, and later accounts of her arrival before Julius Caesar, both describe an atmosphere thick with a specific, overwhelming, carefully chosen scent that preceded her physical arrival by several moments, the scent literally announcing her presence before her body entered the room. This was not vanity. This was calculated psychological and political theater, deployed before a single word of negotiation had even begun, using the oldest and most primal of human senses to shape the emotional temperature of a room before diplomacy even started. Take a slow breath now, let it out completely. We are now roughly at the midpoint of Cleopatra's private morning, and I want you to notice how much has actually happened in what most people assume was simply putting on makeup. Water drawn from cisterns and infused with mineral salt. A small dedicated staff of donkey herders coordinating fresh milk deliveries timed to the queen's exact waking hour. Physicians monitoring oil applications as genuine medical treatment against harsh coastal air. A cosmetician grinding mineral powder with religious and medicinal purpose behind every stroke. A cream whose basic chemical formula still exists in your own bathroom cabinet today. henna applied as quiet daily religious renewal, and a perfume blend chosen with the same strategic precision a general might choose which troops to deploy for a particular battle. And we have not even reached the parts of her mourning that most people actually picture when they think of Cleopatra at all. So let's continue slowly into the next phase. With her face, hands, feet, and body now treated, oiled, and scented, the sky outside would have brightened considerably, and this is the point at which the character of the room truly changed. More attendants entered. The quiet, intimate hush of the earliest hours gave way to something more closely resembling what we might actually recognize as the beginning of royal preparation, though still nothing like the full spectacle that would eventually emerge by the time she was ready to be seen by the court. At this stage, a mirror was brought forward, and I want to pause here, because the mirror itself deserves real attention, since it tells us something genuinely important about both the technology and the psychology of this entire ritual. Cleopatra's mirror would not have been glass in the way we understand mirrors today. Glass mirrors with silvered backing were still many centuries away from invention. Instead, her mirror was a highly polished disc of bronze, sometimes with a small percentage of silver mixed into the alloy to improve reflectivity. Polished by specialized craftsmen using increasingly fine abrasive powders until the surface achieved a reflection clear enough to show fine detail, though still noticeably softer and slightly distorted compared to a modern glass mirror, giving every reflection a subtly warm golden cast because of the bronze itself. This mirror was mounted on an ornate handle, often carved from ivory or gilded wood, sometimes shaped into the form of a lotus flower or the head of the god or goddess Hathor, since Hathor was closely associated with beauty, love, and the protective power of mirrors themselves in Egyptian religious tradition. And here is something that genuinely surprises most people when they first learn it. This mirror, this single object, was considered valuable enough and personal enough that it would have been guarded with almost the same level of security as a piece of royal jewelry, because a mirror that had touched the queen's own reflection, that had, in the deeply symbolic thinking of ancient Egyptian religion, captured something of her image and her divine essence, could not simply be left lying around for any servant to pick up. Specific attendants were responsible for the mirror's care, its polishing, its storage in a dedicated case when not in use, and its transport between chambers. And this responsibility was itself considered an honor, a position of trust within the palace hierarchy. Holding this mirror, Cleopatra would begin the final, most detailed phase of her facial preparation, the application of color. And this is where ancient cosmetic technology reveals itself as genuinely sophisticated in ways that consistently surprise people who assume ancient makeup was crude or simple. For color on her cheeks and lips, the most common base substance was red ochre, a naturally occurring iron oxide mineral, ground extremely fine and mixed with a small amount of fat or oil to create a workable paste. Though for someone of Cleopatra's status, more expensive alternatives were also available and likely used at least on certain days, including a red dye derived from crushed insects, specifically a scale insect related to the same family that would later produce the famous cochineal dye of the Americas, though the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world had its own related insect species used for this exact purpose long before contact with the New World. This insect-derived red pigment produced a noticeably more vibrant, almost jewel-toned red compared to the more muted, earthy red of simple ochre, and it was considerably more expensive to produce, since it required collecting and processing enormous quantities of tiny insects to yield even a small, usable amount of pigment, making it a genuine luxury good reserved for royalty and the very wealthy. This red substance was applied to her lips using a small brush, likely made from a thin reed with softened, frayed fibers at one end, and to her cheeks using a slightly different technique, dabbed on with a soft cloth or even, according to some ancient sources, applied directly with a fingertip and then blended outward with light, patting motions, a technique that modern makeup artists would recognize instantly, since patting rather than rubbing color into the cheek remains the standard professional technique for a natural-looking flush even today. More than 2,000 years after Cleopatra's own attendants were using this exact same method. Now we return briefly to her eyes, because the kohl prepared earlier in the morning was finally ready for application at this stage, and the technique used here was, again, far more sophisticated than most people assume. The kohl was applied using a small stick, often made of polished wood, bone, or occasionally precious materials like ivory for royal use, dipped into the prepared powder, and then carefully drawn along the upper lash line, extended outward and slightly upward at the outer corner in the elongated, almond shape that has become instantly recognizable from surviving Egyptian art across thousands of years. A second, often lighter application, sometimes using the green malachite-based mixture we mentioned earlier, was drawn along the lower lash line and sometimes extended slightly further down toward the cheek, creating the distinctive, dramatic eye shape that ancient Egyptian art consistently depicts across pharaohs, queens, and nobility for literally thousands of years before Cleopatra was even born, meaning that when we look at her eyes in this moment, we are looking at the continuation of a beauty tradition already ancient and venerable, even in her own time, a tradition stretching back further before her than she is now removed from us, which is a genuinely staggering thought if you let yourself sit with it. Cleopatra is closer in time to us than she was to the builders of the Great Pyramids, and yet the kohl on her eyes that morning connected her backward through an unbroken chain of beauty practice, stretching across nearly 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization before her own. Moment in history. Let that thought settle over you gently as you continue to relax. Layers upon layers of time, folding over each other in that one small pot of dark powder, and the careful hand drawing it across her eyelid in the strengthening morning light. With her eyes complete, a final light dusting of a pale mineral powder, likely containing ground chalk or a similar pale mineral base, mixed with a small amount of oil to help it adhere, might be applied across her forehead and the bridge of her nose, intended to create a smooth, even, slightly luminous complexion, particularly valued in a society where extended time indoors, away from the harsh Egyptian sun, was itself a subtle marker of high status, since a paler, more even complexion signaled that a woman did not need to labor outdoors, a visual class marker that existed across many ancient Mediterranean societies in remarkably similar form. At this point in the morning, with her skin treated, her eyes lined, her lips and cheeks colored, and her natural hair still simply oiled and close-cropped beneath what would soon become an elaborate wig, Cleopatra's most private and personal preparation was essentially complete. What remained after this point moved into an entirely different category of activity, the actual construction of her public royal image involving elaborate wigs, jewelry, and the full ceremonial regalia that most people picture when they imagine her. But that process, fascinating as it is, belongs more properly to the story of how Cleopatra dressed rather than how she cared for her skin, and it involved an entirely different and much larger team of specialized attendants. A genuine transition from the intimate, quiet ritual of skincare. We have spent this hour exploring together into the loud, complex, heavily staffed machinery of royal presentation. But let's linger a little longer in this quieter space before we close, because there is something worth reflecting on now that we have traveled through this entire morning together. What strikes most careful historians who study this material is not the exotic or unusual nature of any single ingredient we have discussed tonight. Moringa oil, donkey's milk, beeswax, rosewater, henna, kohl, red ochre, myrrh. These were not, in themselves, wildly exotic to the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Versions of many of these practices existed among wealthy women, across Greece, Rome, Persia, and throughout the Egyptian aristocracy more broadly, not exclusively within the royal family. What made Cleopatra's morning genuinely unique was not the ingredients themselves, but the scale, the precision, and the sheer coordinated human effort dedicated to perfecting and maintaining this ritual every single day without fail. The donkey herders, whose entire professional purpose was fresh milk at dawn, the perfumers who maintained production facilities near the Dead Sea, specifically, to supply her personal scent needs. The cosmeticians whose family recipes for kohl and cream had been refined across generations, specifically in service to the royal household. The mirror craftsmen, the linen weavers, the physicians monitoring her oils as genuine medical treatment, an entire quiet economy of specialized human skill and labor, converging every single morning on one woman's face and body, in the dark, before the rest of the world had even woken up. And perhaps this is the truest thing we can say about Cleopatra's morning skincare routine, the thing that separates the real history from the popular legend. It was never really about vanity at all. It was about control. In a world where a queen's political power could evaporate overnight through betrayal, assassination, or simple loss of favor, The 1 hour of her day when Cleopatra had absolute, total control over every single variable, every ingredient, every attendant, every action, was this quiet hour before dawn, alone or nearly alone with her own reflection in a disk of polished bronze. Everything else in her day, the negotiations, the ceremonies, the pressures of Roman generals and Egyptian priests, and a court constantly whispering with rival factions, all of that involved variables she could not fully control. But this hour, this ritual, refined and repeated identically, morning after morning for years, was entirely hers. And so, as we close tonight's story, I want you to imagine her one final time. The sky over Alexandria has fully lightened now. The great lighthouse's flame has been extinguished for the day, no longer needed against the darkness. Somewhere beyond her chamber walls, the vast machinery of the Ptolemaic court is beginning to stir. Scribes preparing documents, soldiers changing guard, ambassadors rehearsing the words they will use when they finally stand before her. But for one more quiet moment, before any of that begins, Cleopatra sits, with her polished bronze mirror in her hands, looking at her own reflection, complete now, prepared now, ready now to become, for the rest of this long day, the living goddess that an empire needed her to be. And then slowly she sets the mirror down and rises, and the day begins. Let your own day end now, here in this quiet moment we have shared together. Let the oils and milk and rosewater and slow morning light fade gently from your mind, the way morning mist fades from the surface of the Nile. You have traveled 2,000 years back in time tonight, into the most private hour of one of history's most powerful women. And now it is time to let all of that gently go, and rest and sleep.